Hello, this is Chaplain David, and I'm doing a recording for Sunday, May 24th, 2020. And I'm continuing my series called Becoming Ever Mindful, which of course is inspired by the book that I wrote of the same title. And you can find that, as you can see on the slide here. You can get it from Amazon or Indigo or Chapters. You can also go to Better Books and Bibles if you're here in Calgary. If you can't afford one, just email me, davids@theseed. I would be glad to either give you a copy or send you a digital download code so that you can just download it yourself. If you can't afford one, I'm not here to try to make money off of this. It's just something God put in my heart, and I wanted to make sure I shared it in due diligence. So as you can see on the slide, discovering how God can speak to us, through us, and around us, becoming ever mindful simply means focusing your mind and actions towards your number one goal at all times and not allowing any distractions to deter your course. And I, of course, wrote this with the perspective of being a Christian and hearing God's plan and His voice in your life and just removing those distractions so that you do truly hear Him. Removing those barriers. So if you're doing God's will, which I say is simply following His word and commands, then you will learn His calling, which is the plan He has for your life. It's pretty simple, really, as long as we just stay focused and we listen to God and we are obedient to what He says. Just a quick overview. I talked last week, Hebrews 11 tells us that without faith it's impossible to please God. And then God says in Isaiah 55:11 that His word will not return to Him empty, but it will accomplish what He desires and achieve the purpose for which He sent it. We need to understand that God can do the seemingly impossible, and Satan cannot stop Him unless we allow Him to. Paul encouraged us in Ephesians 4:27 to not give the devil a foothold, so we do have a choice. And then last week I talked about the story of Moses, mostly the beginning from Exodus 2 and 3, where he was just minding his own business when God called to him from the burning bush. And he, of course, had lots of excuses, but God just kept reminding him that He would be there with him every step of the way. And that's the same God we serve today. Again, Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. God and His word remain the same no matter what. Even in a difficult situation like COVID-19 or anything else you might be dealing with, your current situation is not indicative of God's presence in your life. I'll say that again. Your current situation, it's not a good indicator all the time of how God is working in your life. Because along the journey, we're going to get stopped, we're going to get distracted, we're going to get frustrated. But we need to understand that God's word remains the same and that His plan remains the same for you. And we need to just keep following that plan. So last week I talked about the simple fact that He can do whatever He wants, and Satan cannot stop Him, again, unless we allow him to. And I ended last week with a challenge, which I call a practice point. Are there areas in your life where God is calling you to do something, but you just keep making excuses? Are you letting Satan have power over you in that? It's important to write those things down and to lay them at God's altar and just pray about them and ask Him for wisdom and clarity, because I believe He'll do that. So today I want to talk about one of the chapters in my book called Discipline. I actually have it broken down into 2 chapters because discipline is so important and necessary for our walk. And it means many different things and it leads to different things, and in the book you'll discover that. But for today's purposes, I just want to explain discipline is a homonym, meaning it has more than one possible meaning. Sometimes it sounds the same or it's spelled the same, but the word discipline can mean working hard and being dedicated, and it can also mean the act of teaching or enforcing acceptable behaviors. But for now, I actually want to talk about the word discipline in the context of the verb, which is something you do intentionally, something you intentionally do. It's a choice that you make. And we're going to see that in some of the following stories about Isaac, which I'll get into here in a second. But just to pause on the word discipline, obviously we put discipline in every aspect of our life. Getting up on time to get to work or school, maybe finishing that book that you need to read, or working out or eating right. Discipline, we apply that in so many areas of our lives, and it's important that we apply that same discipline in our walk with God. So today we're going to talk about Isaac. I'll give you a quick overview of his early story because he would have had this hanging over his head. And I want you to imagine this from his perspective. So many of you know Abram and Sarai from Genesis 11. They couldn't have children, but when Abram was 75, God promised to bless him with descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And this is through your birth. Again, seeing this from Isaac's perspective, you know that because of your birth, God was going to bless your parents. So after 10 years of them waiting on God, they gave up. They gave up on God's plan. And they kind of took matters into their own hands, which of course ended terribly with Hagar and Ishmael and that whole issue, which I won't get into today. So later, around 13 years later, God reestablished a promise and changed the names of your parents to Abraham and Sarah. Pretty powerful. Because of God's promise about you, he's changed their names and he's promised them that they'll have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. So no pressure, right? And then, of course, to make matters a little bit worse, about 20 years later or so, the theologians think it's around 20 years, when God told Abraham to sacrifice him. So now you clearly know what's going on. You aren't a child. You understand how this works, and your father's taking you to be sacrificed, and he's actually going through with it. And just as he's about to drop that axe on your head, the angel stops him. And you know at that moment that God's provision is amazing. I'm sure, like, whew, that was close. But you have this kind of hanging over your head. You are the promised child. Your parents have been blessed through you. Your dad was tested mightily with something he did not want to do, but he was going to go through with it because of how much he believed in God's promise. And you survived that. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit to after Abraham has died, and Isaac is kind of doing his own thing. He's living in the promised land that God had promised to those, to his father and to the descendants, and it's through you that these descendants are supposed to come. So, again, no pressure, right? Like, not a big deal. So here we're going to see some really interesting facets of discipline, and some good and some not so good. But in Genesis 26, we start out with the fact that there is a famine in the land. This promised land that you are living in, that God promised to your father, you're living there and there's a famine. Pretty difficult. And I just can't help with, kind of thinking about that from my own perspective of, God promising me things, or I think he's promised me things, and then I'm going through with all the things that I should be doing, but things aren't really going the way I hoped. So Genesis 26:1, now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. So that tells us that Isaac had already gone through this. He knew about Abraham going through a famine, and he knew what his dad did, which isn't necessarily good having all of that knowledge, because you see, he goes to Abimelech. Abimelech is actually just a title. It's not necessarily a name. Abimelech is just kind of like a kingly title. And he was the king of the Philistines in Gerar. So it's important to note that, of course, Isaac's living in this land, and he is experiencing this famine, and he decides to just leave. I don't see anything in the text telling me that he stopped and asked God for wisdom or guidance, and that always bothers me, that we just act without asking God for wisdom. And of course, I've definitely done the same thing myself, so I'm not criticizing Isaac too harshly, but we really just get ourselves into trouble. And you can't help but notice the parallel of his father, Abraham and Sarah, taking matters into their own hands, just acting without waiting on God. So here, fortunately, God stops him. In verse 2, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in the land for a while, and I will be with you. I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham." And we know later in verse 6 it says that Isaac did stay in Gerar. Now what's interesting is he didn't actually go back to where he came from, because we know from the very beginning that it says he started to go to Abimelech, who was the king of the Philistines, in Gerar. So we know that he was heading south, going to Gerar. God stopped him somewhere along the way, and instead of him actually making that 180-degree turn and going all the way back, he just stops there. So he's kind of practicing discipline. He's kind of doing what God is telling him, but not fully. And I can't help but think of in 1 Samuel 15 when King Saul is told to completely wipe out the Amalekites, and he doesn't do it. He doesn't go through with the as planned. He does wipe some of them out, but he keeps some of those cherished possessions for himself. And because of that, the Amalekites are a burr in the side of the Israelites for a very, very long time. And God actually takes the kingship from King Saul. At that time is where God actually says that he was grieved that he made Saul king. So it's kind of that same idea, not quite as severe, but God is saying, don't go to Egypt, turn around and go back to where I sent you from, or where you were. And obviously he stops, so he doesn't go through with his plan, but he doesn't go all the way back, which creates some problems, as it always does when we take matters into our own hands. When we don't practice discipline the way God it tells us to do it, usually, I would say always, ends horribly for ourselves. This is where it gets back into the good discipline. Isaac didn't just sit around waiting for that to happen, this new promise that God gave him. He went to work. He planted some crops, and he worked the land, and he is blessed tremendously by God, which is just like God's character, isn't it? Even though we aren't fully following through with what he is telling us to do, when we show those little glimpses, those signs of obedience, of discipline, of still following God's plan in some way, or still at least trying, God still blesses us. I love that God didn't just leave Isaac because he didn't follow through perfectly with the plan. So he blesses him, and of course the Philistines see that, just like any person in your life that might see you being blessed by God. They become jealous and sometimes take it out on you. And so that's what happened to Isaac, of course. So of course the Philistines take it out on Isaac, and they fill in some of the wells that Abraham had actually dug. So Isaac isn't able to use those, which would be pretty hard to take. It's not so much the prosperity piece, because they weren't producing water most likely at that time, or it wouldn't be important in the story. And the fact that it was something his father had done, it was kind of like a heritage that his father had left for him. And the Philistines come and just fill those in. You know, it's a pretty important thing to have water, especially in kind of like a desert land. It's the most important thing. So that was probably hard to take. And then the king, Abimelech, tells him to leave, that he wants him to move. So he had already not gone all the way into where he was originally going to go. He stopped and, kind of settled there and produced crops. And the king is saying, no, we need you to get out of here. And that's so disappointing. Again, Isaac is really, for the most part, doing the right thing, but it's just not going that well. So he moves and he reopens those wells, which must have been pretty difficult. It must have been a lot of work to do that. And now he finds water there, which is amazing. Again, wow, God is blessing me. He's doing awesome things for me. But of course, the herders and the people of Gerar see this, and now there's a turf dispute. I can see it saying, "Hey, this is our land. This is our water." Of course, Isaac's saying, "No, these are our wells. These are the wells my father dug." And we don't actually see that dialogue, but you can just assume, much like in Calgary and Edmonton and Alberta, if I were to find oil in my backyard, it would be pretty amazing, but I'm sure the province would come and say, "No, that's actually our oil. We need you to move." It's kind of the same idea. So Isaac moves and digs again. So you don't see anything in here about him complaining or whining. And then there's another disagreement which ensues. We don't know for sure if he actually found water, but there is a well, and he's digging that. And of course there's a turf war. So he moves again and digs another well, and finally finds peace. He can settle in and just kind of live his life. Now we see him practicing discipline by not complaining or retaliating, but just moving and working hard again. But then we fast forward to Genesis 26, verse 26. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar to Isaac. And Isaac asked them, "Hey, what's going on here? Why have you come to me? Since you were hostile to me and sent me away, like, what's going on?" They answered, "Hey, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you, and so we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us." Isn't that funny? Now that Abimelech knows he can't beat Isaac, Isaac is going to be blessed wherever he goes. Abimelech's deciding we should make an agreement. So let us make a treaty with you that you will do to us no harm, just as we did no harm to you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. He's kind of fudging the numbers there a little bit, right? He didn't treat him that great. But fair enough, let bygones be bygones. And Abimelech says, "And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. Now we should pause there because it seems like things are going pretty well, but apparently they hadn't actually found water in the well yet, because the very next verse says that day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We've found water." So Isaac did practice discipline, kind of. He did keep working diligently. He didn't just accept his fate. He didn't whine and complain. He did the right thing by following God's ways above his own plan. But he wouldn't have had to go through the trouble of digging more wells if he had just obeyed God perfectly in the first place. And, that's so us. We just kind of have to buck the system. We have to do things our own way, or kind of do them the right way, but still hang on to a little bit of our pride. And here, it just made his life so much more difficult. However, God was always with him and blessed him for his efforts, even though he was causing his own troubles. And I just love that Isaac never actually retaliated. He just kind of moved on and trusted that God would provide. And obviously God did provide. So in finishing off with this message about discipline, I want to have one more practice point. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us, "Do not forget this one thing, dear friends, with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." Whew. That puts patience in a whole new perspective, doesn't it? When I'm sitting at the drive-thru at McDonald's and it's taking more than 15 minutes, I'm starting to get frustrated. What about 1,000 years? Where in your life do you just need to have a little more discipline, maybe a little more patience? And once again, I encourage you to write that down, to think about it, to pray about it, to lay it at the altar of God and allow Him to give you wisdom and guidance. So that's been my message today about discipline. Hopefully you've learned some things through Isaac's story, and hopefully you've learned some things from your own story, and you don't have to repeat the past. We don't have to take the path of least resistance. Just because something went wrong in Isaac's life, he immediately went to what he knew. He immediately followed in his father's footsteps, which if you actually follow the parallel of Abraham's story, it didn't go so well either. But we need to learn what God is telling us and to follow that plan and to trust Him with it. And I pray that for you today. So God bless you.